The cold steel of a gun pressed flush against the base of Julian Vance's spine. The man holding the weapon wasn't a rival assassin, it was Silas, his fiercely loyal second-in-command. "Shoot the boss." Marcus Thorne's voice echoed over the rusted PA system, dripping with sadistic joy as he pressed a silver revolver against the temple of Silas's weeping, terrified little girl. "Put a bullet through his spine, or watch your daughter die." Silas let out a raw, agonizing sob. His scarred face was slick with rain and tears, his hand shaking so violently the barrel rattled against Julian's wet tuxedo. Eleanor stood just 10 feet away, her heart hammering in her throat, the heavy, ruined silk of her crimson gown clinging to her freezing skin. Her dark eyes were wide with sheer panic as she stared at the man she had only agreed to fake marry. Julian didn't flinch. The most ruthless cartel boss in the underworld simply locked his icy blue eyes with Eleanor's, his hardened features softening into a profoundly peaceful, devastating smile. Without breaking eye contact with her, Julian unholstered his own weapon and tossed it away into the dark tracks. "I'm not fighting you," Julian said, his voice a calm, lethal rumble. "The Empire is dead. How did a desperate, fake marriage contract turn a brilliant, plus-size archivist into the underworld's ultimate target, and bring the city's most dangerous mafia king completely to his knees?" Hit that subscribe button, and let's rewind to the day this deadly game began. The day Eleanor Hayes sold her soul to Chicago's most dangerous man. She was wearing a vintage mustard trench coat and standing over the 19th century blueprints that were about to save his life. The Chicago Historical Archive was a sanctuary of dust and forgotten echoes. It smelled of old paper, binding glue, and impending doom. Ellie stood behind the heavy mahogany circulation desk. She traced the faded blue ink of a Prohibition-era architectural draft. It was a map of the underground tunnels. They ran beneath the city's shipping ports. They were relics of a bygone era. They were also the only collateral she had left. The bank had sent their final notice. Foreclosure was not a threat anymore. It was a promise. The heavy brass doors of the archive groaned open. The sound shattered the cathedral-like silence of the room. Ellie did not look up immediately. She carefully rolled the brittle parchment. She slipped it into a protective leather tube. Only then did she raise her eyes. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. Julian Vance did not walk into a room. He invaded it. He was a man built out of sharp angles and cold calculation. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that clung to the heavy muscle of his shoulders. His dark hair was perfectly swept back. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line. His eyes were the color of shattered ice. They swept over the rows of dusty bookshelves with blatant disdain. Behind him stood two massive men in dark coats. They looked like walking walls of concrete. One of them, a man with a scarred jaw named Silas, stepped forward to lock the brass doors from the inside. "The archive is closed," Ellie said. Her voice was steady. It echoed loudly in the empty space. She crossed her plump arms over her chest. The bright mustard yellow of her oversized vintage coat stood out violently against the drab, gray shadows of the room. Julian slowly turned his glacial gaze to her. He did not blink. He walked down the center aisle. His leather shoes made sharp, measured clicks against the marble floor. He stopped exactly 3 feet from the circulation desk. He radiated a dangerous, suffocating heat. "I am aware of your hours, Miss Hayes," Julian said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone. It was a voice used to giving orders that ended lives. "I am also aware of your debts." Ellie felt a cold spike of adrenaline. She gripped the edge of the desk. She refused to shrink back. She was a plus-size woman who had spent her entire life taking up space in rooms that wanted her to be small. She was not about to cower now. "My debts are none of your business. If you are here for a tour, you will have to come back tomorrow. If you are here to extort me, you are wasting your time. There is no money here." Julian pulled a pristine white envelope from his inner jacket pocket. He tossed it onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. That is the deed to this building, Julian stated calmly. I bought your debt from the holding company this morning. The foreclosures are canceled. The archive belongs to me. Ellie stared at the envelope. Her breath caught in her throat. Decades of history. The stories of marginalized people. The records of the working class who built Chicago. All of it now belonged to the head of the Vance syndicate. Why? Ellie demanded. Her dark eyes flashed with sudden, fiery anger. What does a cartel boss want with a room full of dead history? Julian leaned his large palms against the desk. He leaned in close. He smelled of expensive cologne, rain, and cold iron. I do not care about your history books, Miss Hayes. I care about the geography. Specifically, the 19th century blueprints you just placed inside that leather tube. Ellie's hand instinctively covered the tube. The Prohibition tunnels. They connected the docks directly to the rail yards without ever seeing the street. Marcus Thorne controls the overground routes, Julian continued. His voice was devoid of emotion. He is running a human trafficking ring. He uses his legitimate shipping fronts to move people. I am going to gut his operation. I am going to take the port contracts tonight. But to move my own legitimate cargo undetected, I need those underground routes. I need those blueprints. Ellie stared at him. She processed the cold, tactical nature of his words. You want to bypass his routes. You want to outmaneuver him. Yes, and if I refuse to give them to you, then I burn this building to the ground with everything in it, Julian replied effortlessly. It was not a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, but I prefer a cleaner transaction. I am offering you a trade. The blueprints. And your cooperation. Cooperation. Ellie scoffed. She stood entirely her ground. I am an archivist, not a mobster. I have a dinner tonight, Julian said, standing back up to his full, intimidating height. It is a sit-down with the European shipping magnates. They are traditional men. They do not trust unstable syndicates. They do not trust men without families. If I walk in there alone, Thorne will convince them I am a liability. I need to present a united front. I need a wife. Silence slammed into the room. Ellie blinked. She looked at his cold, dead eyes. Then she let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It echoed off the high ceilings. Julian's lieutenants shifted nervously. Nobody laughed at Julian Vance. You want me to be your fake wife? Ellie asked incredulously. Look at me, Mr. Vance. I am a 32-year-old historian. I wear thrifted coats. I am loud. I am fat. I am entirely unapologetic. I am not a quiet, trembling runway model who is going to sit there and look pretty for your cartel friends. I do not want a runway model, Julian countered. His eyes narrowed. He looked at her with a terrifying intensity. Thorne would see through a hired escort in 10 seconds. I need a woman with gravity. I need someone who looks like she could run an empire if I caught a bullet. I need intelligence. You will play the part. You will smile. You will secure this contract. In exchange, this archive remains yours, free and clear. Ellie looked down at the white envelope. This building was her life. It was the only thing anchoring her to the world. She looked back up at Julian. She saw the absolute ruthlessness in his posture. He viewed people as chess pieces. He viewed her as a shield. Fine, Ellie said. Her voice was pure steel. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a heavy black fountain pen. But I do not work for free, and I do not work without terms. Julian raised an eyebrow, fascinated. Terms, I know how your world works, Ellie said softly, stepping around the desk to face him directly. She was shorter than him, but she did not feel small. You treat human life like currency. You kill whoever gets in your way. I will not be a party to murder. If I do this, if I stand by your side tonight, you sign an addendum right now. She grabbed a blank sheet of archival paper. She began to write in flowing, angry script. No innocent blood will be shed on my watch, Ellie stated, her pen scratching loudly. You do not execute anyone. You do not harm the staff. You act like a civilized human being. A true king protects his people. Julian, a tyrant just builds a bigger graveyard. Human life is not a bargaining chip. Silas, standing by the door. choked on a cough. No one spoke to the boss like that. Julian stared at the bold, defiant woman in front of him. Something flickered deep behind his icy eyes. It was a ghost of a memory, a crack in his armor. He looked at the paper she shoved against his chest. He took the pen from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers. His skin was burning hot. He signed his name with violent, sharp strokes. The deal is struck. Julian murmured. Silas will take you to the penthouse to prepare. Do not disappoint me. Eleanor Julian turned and walked toward the exit. Ellie let out a shaky breath, clutching the deed to her archive. She had just made a deal with the devil. As Julian reached the brass doors, Silas stepped close to him. Silas kept his voice low, but the acoustics of the empty archive carried the whisper directly to Ellie's ears. Boss, Silas murmured, his scarred face tight with anxiety. My inside guy just reported back. Thorne knows about the girl. He knows we are making a move. Julian did not even break his stride. Let him come. Silas swallowed hard. The dinner tonight. It is a trap. Julian pushed the heavy doors open, stepping out into the freezing Chicago rain. I know, Julian Vance demanded a quiet, compliant fake wife to survive the high-stakes dinner. Instead, he got a force of nature who did not just play the part. She rewrote the entire script. The penthouse suite of the Vance Hour was a monument to sterile luxury. It was all glass, brushed steel, and cold leather. For the past 3 hours, it had been a battleground. Julian had sent a team of elite stylists. They had arrived with racks of muted, dark, structure-heavy gowns. They had brought corsets designed to minimize, to compress, to hide. Ellie had fired them all within 20 minutes. She stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She adjusted the heavy silk of her own dress. She had refused the black shifts. She had chosen a custom-draped crimson ball gown. It was magnificent. The rich, luminous fabric clung beautifully to her wide hips. It cinched at her natural waist. The off-the-shoulder neckline proudly displayed her cross of shoulders and full chest. She did not look like a woman trying to shrink herself to fit into a mafia boss's shadow. She looked like a queen who already owned his empire. The bedroom door clicked open. Julian stepped inside. He wore a flawless midnight blue tuxedo. It made him look like a shadow cast by a very dangerous fire. He held a velvet jewelry box in his hand, but as he looked up and saw Ellie, his footsteps completely halted. The breath visibly left his lungs. The hard, ruthless mask he wore for the world completely shattered for a fraction of a second. He stared at her. He took in her soft, wide curves. He saw the unapologetic boldness of the red dress. He saw the fire in her dark eyes. You fired the stylists, Julian managed to say. His voice was unusually thick. It had lost its cold edge. I am not going to wear a torture device to make your cartel friends comfortable, Ellie replied smoothly. She turned to face him. She smoothed her hands over the heavy silk of her skirt. If I am going to play the wife of Julian Vance, I am going to take up space. Julian slowly closed the distance between them. The sheer volume of her presence in the room was intoxicating to him. He was a man who lived in a world of sharp edges and skeletal, fragile women. Ellie's absolute solidity was the most grounding sensation he had ever experienced. He opened the velvet box. Inside rested a massive, flawless emerald-cut diamond ring. It was heavy and ostentatious. Hold out your hand, Julian murmured. He stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from his broad chest. Ellie extended her left hand. Julian's calloused, scarred fingers took hers. The contrast between his violent hands and her soft skin made Ellie's breath hitch. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Tonight, you answer to no one but me, Julian whispered. He did not let go of her hand. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. And if anyone in that room looks at you with anything less than absolute respect, I will carve their eyes out. Understood, understood, Ellie replied softly. She felt a shiver race down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. The armored SUV glided through the rain-swept streets of Chicago. It pulled to a silent halt outside an unmarked, elite dining club in the Gold Coast district. The air inside the club was thick with the scent of white truffles, aged bourbon, and the unspoken tension of absolute power. Julian stepped out first. The rain slicked his dark hair. He offered Ellie his hand when she emerged. The crimson silk of her gown contrasted violently with the damp, gray night. The murmurs of the valet and station security guards fell instantly dead. Ellie did not rush. She stepped onto the pavement with deliberate, grounded poise. She linked her arm through Julian's. She felt the rigid, coiled tension in his bicep. He was walking into a room full of loaded guns. They entered the subterranean private dining room. 3 European shipping magnates sat at the heavy oak table. They were flanked by lieutenants from Marcus Thorne's cartel. The cartel men wore flashy suits. They had cruel, calculating eyes. The men expected a terrified escort. They expected a woman who would stare at her plate and speak only when spoken to. Ellie gave them no such satisfaction. Instead of waiting for Julian to introduce her, she stepped forward. She extended her plump, manicured hand with a warm, commanding smile. She greeted the lead magnate, a stern German named Richter, in flawless, unaccented German. She complimented the architectural history of his family's port in Hamburg. Richter blinked in profound surprise. He slowly stood up, taking her hand. The ice in the room began to thaw. The dinner that followed was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Ellie played the maestro. She did not just sit there looking pretty. She steered the entire conversation. When Thorne's men tried to test Julian by dropping rapid-fire questions about complex logistics, Ellie seamlessly interjected. She utilized her encyclopedic knowledge of history. She cited the shipping delays of the 1920s. She mapped out the exact tonnage limits of the underground routes Julian's was secretly acquiring. She painted a picture of a grounded, passionate, and unshakable partnership between her and Julian. She ate heartily. She savored the rich food. She proved she was entirely comfortable in her own skin and entirely unafraid of their dangerous world. Julian sat silently beside her. He was mesmerized. He watched her defend his empire better than any lawyer on his payroll. By the time the espresso was served, Richter was looking at Julian not as a volatile young boss, but as a seasoned leader anchored by a brilliant, powerful wife. The multi-million-dollar contract was placed on the table, but then the atmosphere shifted. A young, terrified waitress approached the table carrying a silver tray of after-dinner drinks. Her hands were shaking violently. As she reached to place a heavy crystal glass in front of one of Thorne's lieutenants, her foot slipped. The glass tipped. A splash of amber liquid spilled directly onto the sleeve of the lieutenant's expensive jacket. "Stupid bitch," the mobster roared. He shot out of his chair, his hand raised, fully intending to strike the young girl across the face. The waitress squeezed her eyes shut, cowering backward in pure terror. Before the mobster's hand could connect, Ellie moved. She stood up with explosive speed. She did not scream. She did not flinch. She stepped directly between the massive mobster and the terrified girl. Her heavy crimson silk skirt swished loudly in the dead, silent room. Ellie grabbed the mobster's raised wrist. Her grip was not strong enough to stop a man of his size, but the sheer, audacious authority in her dark eyes froze him solid. "You will sit down," Ellie commanded. Her voice was not loud. It was absolute. It carried the weight of a seasoned monarch. "And you will apologize to her." Immediately, the entire room held its breath. Julian's hand dropped silently below the table, unholstering his weapon. Silas tensed by the door. The mobster stared at Ellie in disbelief. "She ruined my jacket. It is a cheap polyester blend. It will survive," Ellie replied smoothly. Her gaze never wavered. She was looking at a killer, and she looked at him as if he were a misbehaving child. "You are a guest at my husband's table. In this room, we treat people with dignity. Human life is not your punching bag. Now, take your seat, or leave." The mobster looked past Ellie to Julian. Julian's eyes were black with murderous intent. Julian gave a slow, microscopic nod. The message was clear. "Disobey my wife, and you die." The mobster swallowed hard. He ripped his arm away from Ellie's grip. He sank slowly back into his chair. He did not apologize, but the threat was neutralized. Ellie turned her back on him completely. She placed a gentle, warm hand on the trembling waitress's shoulder. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Ellie asked softly. The girl nodded rapidly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. Do not apologize. Accidents happen. Go to the kitchen. Take a breath. You are perfectly safe." Ellie waited until the girl safely exited through the swinging service doors. Then she calmly turned around. She smoothed her red skirt. She sat back down next to Julian. She picked up her espresso cup and took a slow, elegant sip. Richter stared at her for a long moment. Then, a slow, genuine smile spread across his stern face. He picked up his gold fountain pen. A man who cannot protect the weakest among him cannot protect a shipping fleet. Richter announced loudly to the table. He signed his name at the bottom of the massive contract. "You have a formidable wife, Julian. We are in business." The tension broke. The deal was secured. Julian looked at Ellie. The pride swelling in his chest was foreign, heavy, and intensely real. She had not just played the part. She had completely conquered the room without firing a single shot. As the men stood to shake hands and celebrate, Ellie politely excused herself to use the restroom. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving her exhausted. She walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway toward the back of the club. As she passed a dark alcove near the kitchen, a hand reached out from the shadows. Ellie gasped. She was pulled gently but firmly out of the hallway. It was the young waitress she had just saved. The girl was no longer crying. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with sheer panic. "Ma'am," the waitress whispered frantically, her voice barely a breath. "You have to get your husband out of here, right now." Ellie frowned, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" The waitress shook her head. She gripped Ellie's crimson sleeve with desperate, trembling fingers. "I heard them talking in the alley," the waitress whispered, tears welling in her eyes again. "Thorne's men. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to execute. They locked the exits. Ma'am, they locked the exits. And they are arming up in the kitchen." Victory in Julian's world tasted like expensive champagne. But tonight, as Eleanor Hayes stood in the dimly lit service corridor of the dining club, the air suddenly tasted like ash. The young waitress trembled, her fingers gripping the crimson silk of Ellie's sleeve with a white-knuckled desperation. Ellie's heart slammed against her ribcage, a frantic, heavy rhythm that threatened to deafen her. She looked into the girl's terrified eyes and saw the raw, unfiltered reality of the cartel world Julian Vance inhabited. They locked the exits. They were arming up in the kitchen. Marcus Thorne's men had not come to the Gold Coast district to negotiate a territorial dispute. They had come to orchestrate a massacre. And they planned to bury Julian beneath the expensive marble floors of this very establishment. "Listen to me," Ellie whispered, her voice incredibly steady despite the cold dread pooling in her stomach. She placed both of her soft, warm hands over the girl's trembling ones. "You have done a very brave thing. I need you to go down to the basement, find a utility closet, lock the door, and do not come out until you hear police sirens. Do you understand?" The waitress nodded rapidly, a single tear cutting through the pristine makeup on her cheek. "But what about you?" "I am going to get my husband," Ellie said. The word husband felt strange on her tongue, heavy with a fabricated loyalty that suddenly felt desperately real. "Go now." As the girl vanished into the shadows of the descending stairwell, Ellie closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing her lungs to expand, forcing the panic to recede into a tight, manageable box in the back of her mind. She was an archivist. She spent her life categorizing chaos, making sense of disjointed historical fragments, and analyzing the blueprints of the past. She needed to look at this room not as a death trap, but as an architectural puzzle. She turned and walked back down the plush carpeted hallway toward the private dining room. She did not run. Running would draw the attention of the cartel lieutenants guarding the perimeter. She walked with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a woman who commanded the space around her. As she re-entered the opulent room, Julian was standing by the heavy oak table, finishing his bourbon. He looked magnificent, a dangerous apex predator masquerading in a midnight blue tuxedo. Richter and the other magnates were preparing to leave, shaking hands with Silas. Thorne's lieutenants were hovering near the double doors leading to the main lobby. Ellie's mind raced, mapping the room. The main double doors led to the lobby, which was undoubtedly locked and guarded. The service doors swung directly into the kitchen, where the hit squad was currently loading their weapons. They were entirely boxed in. But Ellie remembered the 19th century architectural records of the Gold Coast district. This building was constructed during Prohibition. Establishments like this always possessed a secondary, undocumented artery. A coal chute, a bootlegger's exit, something hidden beneath the plaster. She walked directly up to Julian. She did not smile. She did not offer a polite excuse to the men at the table. She slid her arm through his, pressing her full, heavy curves flush against his side. "Darling," Ellie murmured, her voice carrying a sweet, melodic tone that completely masked the sheer terror in her eyes. She leaned up, pressing her lips intimately against his jawline. "The exits are locked. There is a hit squad in the kitchen. Do not look at the doors." Julian's entire body went rigid. The shift was microscopic, invisible to anyone who was not pressing against him. But Ellie felt the instantaneous transformation. The sophisticated businessman vanished. The ruthless, hyper-lethal cartel boss snapped to the surface. He did not ask how she knew. He did not doubt her for a single second. "Silas," Julian said, his voice completely flat, devoid of any inflection. Silas looked up from his conversation with Richter. He saw the dead, hollow look in Julian's eyes. Silas's hand immediately drifted beneath his tailored jacket, resting on the grip of his concealed firearm. "Where, Julian?" whispered against Ellie's hair. Behind the decorative wine racks on the east wall, Ellie breathed, keeping her smile fixed as she looked around the room. "This building used to be a speakeasy. There is a ventilation and coal corridor behind that wall that leads directly to the alleyway. I saw the architectural seams in the brickwork when we sat down." Julian's hand clamped around her waist with bruising force. "When I move, you stay behind me. You do not stop moving until we hit the alley." Before Ellie could nod, the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen violently burst open. 4 men dressed in tactical black gear stepped into the dining room. They carried suppressed submachine guns, the long black barrels rising with terrifying synchronization. "Gun," Silas roared, flipping the massive, heavy oak table violently onto its side to create a barricade. The room exploded into deafening chaos. The suppressed weapons spat a deadly barrage of bullets that shredded the expensive wallpaper and shattered the crystal chandeliers. Richter and the magnates dove to the floor, screaming in panic. Julian moved with a speed that defied his massive size. He shoved Ellie hard toward the east wall, his body acting as a human shield. He drew his weapon in a fluid, blinding motion and fired 3 times. 2 of the cartel shooters dropped instantly, their body armor failing to stop the armor-piercing rounds Julian carried. "The wine rack. Push it," Julian shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire. Ellie threw her entire weight against the massive floor-to-ceiling mahogany wine rack. It was incredibly heavy, loaded with hundreds of expensive bottles. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the sound of bullets chewing into the plaster inches from her head. She planted her heels and pushed with all her might. The hidden hinges, rusted but functional, gave way with a loud groan. The rack swung outward, revealing a narrow, pitch-black corridor smelling of old dust and damp earth. "Go," Julian commanded, providing covering fire as Silas dragged the terrified Richter toward the opening. Ellie scrambled into the darkness, the heavy silk of her crimson gown tearing on exposed nails. But she did not care. Julian backed into the corridor last, firing a final suppressing volley before pulling the heavy wine rack shut behind them, plunging them into absolute darkness. They ran. The corridor was suffocatingly tight, built for smuggling crates, not people. Ellie stumbled, her lungs burning. But Julian's large hand was securely wrapped around hers, pulling her forward through the lightless tunnel. Behind them, they could hear Thorne's men shouting, attempting to break through the hidden door. They burst through a rusted iron grate and tumbled out into the freezing, rain-swept alleyway. The cold air hit Ellie like a physical blow. Silas's extraction team had already pulled the armored SUV to the mouth of the alley, the engine roaring. "Get in," Silas yelled, throwing the rear door open. Julian practically threw Ellie into the spacious back seat, diving in right behind her as bullets began to ricochet off the brick walls of the alley. The heavy armored door slammed shut, cutting off the sound of the gunfire. The SUV tore out of the alley, its massive tires and screamings against the wet asphalt as it merged recklessly into the Chicago traffic. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of its occupants. Ellie leaned her head against the tinted, bulletproof glass. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had kept her focused was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, crushing wave of shock. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see blood, but found only the heavy emerald-cut diamond ring sparkling mockingly in the passing streetlights. Julian sat beside her in the darkness. He was staring at her. He was not looking at his phone. He was not barking orders at Silas. He was simply watching the woman beside him. You noticed the architectural seams of a hidden door during a multi-million-dollar negotiation, Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that filled the narrow space. "I am an archivist," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I notice things that are out of place. It is my job. Your job is to preserve old paper." "Eleanor," Julian countered, shifting closer to her on the leather seat, "not to spot an ambush and orchestrate a tactical retreat. You saved my life. You saved my entire syndicate." "I saved myself," Ellie corrected, finally turning to look at him. "And I saved the girl. If I had not stepped in to help the waitress, she never would have warned me. Compassion pays dividends, Julian. Violence just creates more violence." Julian did not argue. He looked at the torn hem of her magnificent crimson gown, at the smudged makeup under her fiercely intelligent eyes. The transactional nature of their agreement evaporated into the heavy, humid air of the car. He had purchased a pawn to sit quietly on his chessboard. Instead, he had acquired a queen who had just flipped the entire board over. The armored Maybach glided into the secure underground garage of the Vance Tower. When the heavy steel doors closed behind them, shutting out the chaos of the city, Ellie finally let out a long, exhausted breath. Up in the penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with a strange, fragile peace. It was a false security. But in that moment, it felt like a sanctuary. Silas and the security detail remained in the outer corridors, sweeping the perimeter and giving the boss a wide berth. Ellie kicked off her ruined heels the moment she stepped onto the marble floor. She felt a sudden, crushing exhaustion in her bones. She turned to head toward the guest suite, desperate to peel off the restrictive, heavy silk, when she noticed a long, bleeding scratch on her shoulder, likely from a protruding nail in the coal chute. "Sit down," Julian ordered softly. It was not a command from a mob boss. It was a genuine request. Ellie blinked in surprise but obeyed, sinking onto the plush velvet sofa in the center of the sprawling living room. Julian disappeared into the master bathroom, returning a moment later with a first aid kit. He knelt on the floor in front of her, completely ruining the sharp crease of his bespoke trousers. "I can do that," Ellie protested weakly. "Let me," Julian murmured. He opened the kit, uncapping a bottle of antiseptic. He moved with an unexpected, startling gentleness. His large, calloused fingers brushed against her bare, soft shoulder, sending a shockwave of heat through her entire body. He cleaned the scratch carefully, his face entirely focused on the task. Ellie looked down at the top of his dark head. She looked at the broad, heavy line of his shoulders. He was the most dangerous man in Chicago, A man who dealt in fear and intimidation. Yet here he was, kneeling before a plus-size archivist in a ruined dress, tending to a minor scrape as if it were a mortal wound. "Why did you do it?" Julian asked quietly, not looking up. "Why did you stand between that man and the waitress? You had the contract. You had the money. You could have looked away. Everyone else did. Because looking away is how monsters are made," Ellie answered, her voice soft but unyielding. "I grew up in a world where people looked right through me. They told me I was too big, too loud, too much. They tried to make me shrink. I promised myself I would never let anyone make another human being feel small or disposable. Not a waitress, not a victim, not anyone. Human life has dignity. Julian, it is not something you can just discard when it inconveniences you." Julian finally looked up, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers. The absolute conviction in her voice struck him harder than any bullet ever could. He had spent his entire life building walls out of brutality, trusting no one, viewing people purely as assets. Then this spectacular, unapologetic woman had walked into his life, demanded her worth, and proved she possessed more courage in her little finger than half his lieutenants. He reached up, his scarred hand gently cupping the side of her face. His thumb traced the soft curve of her cheek. "I built this empire on fear, Ellie," Julian confessed, his voice vibrating with an intense, quiet vulnerability that no one in his world had ever witnessed. "I thought it was the only way to survive. But watching you tonight, watching you command that room with nothing but your intellect and your compassion, it made me realize how hollow my power actually is." Ellie swallowed hard, her practical mind struggling against the intoxicating heat of his touch and the raw honesty in his confession. "You can change it. You have the shipping routes now. You can dismantle the violence. I want to," Julian whispered, leaning closer, his gaze dropped to her soft, parted lips, the scent of rain, gunpowder, an expensive cologne wrapped around her completely. "I don't want the fake arrangement, Eleanor. I want the reality. I want you taking up every inch of space in my life." He pulled her gently forward. Ellie closed her eyes, entirely surrendering to the chaotic, terrifying thrill of this moment. Their lips were mere millimeters apart, the electric anticipation heavy enough to suffocate them. Then the lights flickered. The heavy, suffocating silence of the penthouse was violently shattered by a high-pitched electronic whine. The security panels on the walls flashed a brilliant, blinding red before Ellie could open her eyes. The massive, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows of the penthouse exploded inward. The sound was apocalyptic. Millions of shards of tempered glass rained down upon them like a deadly, glittering storm. The security system had not been breached from the outside. It had been deactivated from the inside. "Down," Julian roared, the vulnerable man vanishing instantly. He lunged forward, throwing his massive frame over Ellie's body, driving her down into the plush velvet cushions of the sofa as a hail of automatic gunfire ripped through the sprawling living room. Julian's weight was crushing, absolute, and fiercely protective. He shielded her completely. But as another volley of bullets chewed through the expensive leather furniture around them, Ellie felt a warm, wet heat begin to soak through the silk of her dress. She looked up, her vision blurred by the chaos and the flashing red emergency lights. Julian's face was inches from hers, contorted in a grimace of pure agony. Blood was pouring down the side of his neck, staining his pristine white collar a brilliant, horrifying crimson. "We have to run," Julian snarled, his eyes blazing with a desperate, lethal fury. "Now, there is a specific kind of terror in realizing your entire world can be erased in a single heartbeat." Ellie Hayes had spent her life studying history, reading about the rise and fall of empires, the sudden, violent shifts of power that altered the course of human destiny. But reading about disaster in a dusty archive was entirely different from feeling its hot, metallic breath on your neck. The penthouse was a war zone. The luxurious Tribeca suite had been reduced to a shredded landscape of shattered glass, pulverized drywall, and the deafening, Rhythmic staccato of automatic gunfire. Julian hauled Ellie to her feet, his massive hand clamping around her wrist with the unyielding grip of a vice. He ignored the blood streaming from the graze on his neck, his face a mask of terrifying, calculated violence. He drew his heavy sidearm, firing blindly toward the shattered windows to force the unseen shooters on the adjacent rooftop to keep their heads down. "Stay low," Julian commanded, pulling her toward the internal hallway. They scrambled over the debris, the heavy crimson silk of Ellie's gown tangling around her legs. The main elevators were compromised, the digital displays flashing offline. The internal breach meant Thorne's men were likely already inside the building, overriding the main systems. "The service stairwell," Julian said, his breathing heavy but controlled. They pushed through the heavy fire door, plunging into the dimly lit, concrete stairwell. The air was cold and smelled of ozone and cordite. Before they could descend the first flight, the door below them slammed open. Two heavily armed men in tactical gear charged up the stairs, their weapons raised. Ellie screamed. A raw primal sound of pure terror. Julian did not hesitate. He stepped cleanly in front of her, absorbing the limited space of the landing. He fired twice in rapid succession. The concussive blasts of his weapon in the enclosed stairwell were physically agonizing. The two men crumpled instantly, tumbling backward down the concrete steps in a tangle of limbs and weaponry. Julian didn't pause to check the bodies. He grabbed Ellie's hand again and dragged her downward. "Silas." Julian barked into the radio clipped to his belt. "Status." Static hissed back, followed by Silas's breathless, frantic voice. They breached the lower lobby. "Boss, we are holding them off at the loading dock, but we are heavily outnumbered. They knew our exact security rotations. We have a massive leak. Get the armored transport to the south freight exit," Julian ordered, his tone leaving no room for failure. "We are coming down." The descent was a blur of burning lungs, the terrifying echo of distant gunfire, and the overwhelming, coppery scent of blood. When they finally burst through the heavy steel doors of the south freight exit, the Chicago night greeted them with a torrential downpour. Silas was waiting, returning fire from behind the open door of a massive, heavily armored SUV. The rain slicked the asphalt, reflecting the muzzle flashes like a strobe light in a nightmare. "Get in," Silas roared, laying down a suppressing barrage toward the shadows of the parking garage. Julian threw Ellie into the back seat, diving in after her. Silas slammed the heavy door shut and scrambled into the driver's seat. The tires shrieked as Silas slammed the accelerator to the floor, tearing through the metal security gate and launching the vehicle onto the rain-swept streets. The interior of the SUV was pitch black, save for the fleeting illumination of passing streetlights. Ellie was shaking so violently her teeth rattled. She curled her knees against her chest. The beautiful, confident woman who had conquered a room full of mafia bosses just hours ago, now entirely reduced to a state of absolute, helpless panic. Julian moved closer to her. He did not say a word. He simply wrapped his massive, heavy arms around her, pulling her trembling, soft body flush against his chest. He buried his face in her wet, tangled hair, his own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her cheek. He was holding her as if she were the only real thing left in a world that was violently tearing itself apart. Silas drove like a madman, weaving erratically through the late-night traffic, running red lights, and checking the rearview mirror with a frantic intensity. "Where are we going?" Silas yelled over the roar of the massive engine. "The safe houses are compromised. If Thorne has our internal codes, he knows everywhere we could hide. Take us to the warehouse district," Julian ordered, his voice tight. "We need to get off the grid. Head west." Ellie closed her eyes, trying to focus on the steady, powerful rhythm of Julian's chest rising and falling beneath her ear. She tried to tell herself they were safe. They had escaped the club. They had escaped the penthouse. The armor of the SUV was thick enough to stop military-grade weaponry. They just needed to hide. But as the SUV sped westward, tearing through the industrial outskirts of the city, Ellie opened her eyes and looked out the rain-streaked window. The low-hanging clouds over the city were not their usual bruised, charcoal gray. They were glowing. It was a sickly, violent shade of orange, pulsing against the dark skies like a living, breathing monster. As they drove closer to her neighborhood, the smell of burning paper and ash began to seep through the heavy ventilation system of the armored car. A cold, absolute dread settled into the very marrow of Ellie's bones. "Turn left," Ellie whispered, her voice cracking. "Ellie, we need to stay on the main arterial roads to lose any tails," Silas argued, his eyes locked on the road ahead. "Turn left," Ellie screamed, tearing herself out of Julian's arms and lunging toward the partition. "Turn down 4th Street, now." The sheer panic in her voice startled Silas into obedience. He yanked the steering wheel hard, sending the heavy SUV skidding around the corner. The tires came to a screeching, abrupt halt a block later. Through the windshield, the nightmare became a horrifying, undeniable reality. The Chicago Historical Archive was a towering inferno. The 3-story brick building, the sanctuary where Ellie had spent her entire adult life, was entirely consumed by flames. The fire raged with a terrifying, unnatural intensity, suggesting accelerants had been heavily used. Tongues of fire licked violently out of the shattered stained glass windows, reaching toward the sky. The heat radiating from the structure was so intense it could be felt through the armored glass of the vehicle. "No," Ellie breathed, a sound so small, so utterly broken. It barely registered above the roar of the fire. She fumbled for the door handle. "Ellie, stop," Julian yelled, reaching for her, but she was already out. She threw open the heavy door and stumbled out into the freezing rain. She did not run toward the building. The heat was a physical wall pushing her back. She simply stood in the middle of the flooded street, the heavy, rain-soaked silk of her ruined crimson gown clinging to her legs, staring up at the destruction of her entire universe. Thorne had not just retaliated against Julian. He had targeted the one thing Julian had promised to protect. He had targeted Ellie's soul. Inside that burning building were the only remaining records of the forgotten people of Chicago, the diaries of marginalized women, the immigration papers of the working class, the photographs of families who had built the city from the ground up. All of it, decades of meticulous preservation, millions of human stories, were turning to ash, spiraling up into the rainy night sky like gray, meaningless snow. Ellie fell to her knees on the wet asphalt. The impact bruised her flesh, but she felt absolutely nothing. A profound, crushing despair settled over her, heavier than the ocean. It was a suffocating realization of her own absolute powerlessness. She possessed a brilliant mind. She understood history, politics, and the complexities of human nature. She had stood tall and demanded respect from killers. But none of it mattered. Her intellect could not stop a bullet. Her compassion could not extinguish a fire. In the face of pure, unadulterated malice, she was nothing. She let out a sob, a raw, agonizing sound that tore through her throat. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, rocking back and forth on the wet pavement, weeping for the history that was dying in front of her, weeping for the illusion of control she thought she had. Julian stepped out of the vehicle into the rain. He did not bark orders to Silas. He did not scan the rooftops for snipers. He walked slowly toward the woman kneeling in the street, his heart twisting with a violent, unfamiliar agony. He had seen men die. He had ordered the execution of rivals without a second thought. But watching Eleanor Hayes, watching the fierce, brilliant, unapologetic light in her eyes get snuffed out by the cruelty of his world, was the most devastating thing Julian Vance had ever witnessed. He knelt on the wet asphalt beside her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay, because it wasn't. He simply wrapped his massive arms around her trembling, plus-size frame and pulled her against his chest. He buried his face in her wet hair, letting the rain wash the blood from his neck onto her ruined dress. "I am sorry," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate emotion. "I am so incredibly sorry. Eleanor, I brought this darkness to your door." Ellie clung to his lapels, her tears soaking his expensive shirt. It's gone. Julian, the stories, the people, they're all gone. They burned it all just to send a message. They burned a building, Julian said fiercely, gripping her face and forcing her to look into his eyes. They did not burn you. You are the historian. You carry the memory, and I swear to you, on my life, I will build it back for you, brick by brick. I will tear Thorne's empire to the ground and use the ashes to rebuild yours. Ellie looked into his icy blue eyes, seeing the absolute, terrifying sincerity in them. He meant it. He would go to war for her. But the cost of that war was already too high. Before Ellie could respond, the heavy static of Silas's radio crackled loudly over the sound of the roaring fire. Julian's head snapped up, his instincts instantly recalibrating from a grieving man back to a soldier. "Boss," Silas yelled, stepping out of the SUV, his face pale and tight with panic. "The police scanners just went dark on this frequency. The cops aren't coming to put this out." Thorne paid off the dispatchers. Julian stood up, pulling Ellie to her feet and shielding her body with his own. "Then who is inbound?" Silas looked down the dark, rain-swept arterial road leading toward the docks. The headlights of 4 massive, unmarked black tactical vehicles were speeding directly toward them, cutting through the smoke and the rain like predators, closing in for the kill. "It's Thorne's execution squad," Silas said grimly, raising his assault rifle. They tracked the vehicle. "We are completely boxed in." Julian looked at the burning archive, then at the approaching headlights, and finally down at the woman trembling in his arms. The time for running was over. The crushing weight of the cartel war had finally pinned them against the wall, and there was nowhere left to hide. Armor can stop a bullet, but it cannot stop the cold. The standoff in front of the burning Chicago Historical Archive lasted only a fraction of a second, but to Eleanor Hayes, it felt like an eternity. The 4 unmarked tactical vehicles barreled down the rain-slicked arterial road, their high-beam headlights cutting through the thick, choking smoke of the fire. They were not police cruisers. They were matte black predatory machines, heavily reinforced and moving with a synchronized, lethal purpose. Marcus Thorne had not just sent a hit squad to finish the job. He had sent a small army to ensure Julian Vance never saw the dawn. "Get in the car," Julian roared. The raw, guttural sound of his voice snapped Ellie out of her paralyzing grief. He did not wait for her legs to obey. Julian grabbed her by the waist, practically lifting her off the wet pavement, and threw her into the spacious rear cabin of the armored SUV. He dove in immediately behind her as the first volley of heavy-caliber gunfire erupted from the approaching vehicles. The rounds slammed into the thick bulletproof glass and reinforced steel plating of their transport with deafening, concussive thuds. Silas was already slamming the vehicle into reverse. The massive tires shrieked in protest, burning rubber against the flooded asphalt as he executed a violent, stomach-churning J-turn. The heavy SUV spun wildly before Silas slammed the accelerator to the floorboards. The engine roared like a wounded beast, launching them away from the inferno of the archive and into the labyrinth of the industrial district. "They have heavy ordnance." "Boss," Silas yelled over the chaotic din of metal striking metal. He aggressively swerved around an abandoned delivery truck, tires hydroplaning dangerously on the flooded street. "These aren't standard street enforcers. These are private military contractors." Thorne emptied his entire war chest for this hit. Julian pulled Ellie down onto the floorboards of the back seat, shielding her body with his massive frame. The interior of the SUV was a claustrophobic nightmare of flashing shadows, deafening noise, and the terrifying, metallic shrieks of bullets grazing their armor. "Head for the abandoned shipyard at the Navy Pier extension," Julian ordered. His voice was remarkably calm, the cold, calculating syndicate boss taking absolute control. "The roads there are too narrow for a coordinated tactical formation. We can bottleneck them. Use the service tunnels." Ellie lay pressed against the carpeted floor, her heart hammering against her ribs with such violent force she thought it might shatter her sternum. She was hyperventilating, the smell of her burning archive still clinging to her wet hair. mixing sickeningly with the metallic tang of Julian's blood and the sharp scent of gunpowder. She looked up at Julian. His face was bathed in the red glow of the emergency panel lights. He was bleeding, exhausted, and hunted. Yet his eyes were entirely focused on her survival. The chase was a chaotic, bone-rattling descent into madness. Silas navigated the labyrinthine industrial roads with terrifying precision, taking blind corners at lethal speeds. The tactical vehicles pursued them relentlessly. The pursuit tore through chain-link fences, shattered wooden barricades, and sent rusted debris flying into the torrential Chicago rain. They breached the entrance to the abandoned shipyard. It was a desolate wasteland of rusted shipping containers, decaying dry docks, and massive, skeletal cranes looming against the night sky like the bones of dead giants. The rain fell in blinding sheets here, coming off the freezing expanse of Lake Michigan and whipping across the concrete piers. Silas drove the SUV down a narrow, claustrophobic corridor formed by two towering stacks of rusted shipping containers. "We are funneling them," Julian yelled, bracing himself against the door panel. "Keep pushing toward the deep water pier. We just need to buy enough time to call for a secondary extraction." But as they burst out of the container corridor onto the wide, open expanse of the final concrete pier, a horrifying realization slammed into them. The pier did not end in a service road. It ended abruptly in the black, churning freezing waters of the Chicago River where it met the lake. Worse, out of the shadows of a massive, decaying warehouse to their left, a fifth vehicle emerged. It was not an SUV. It was a heavily modified, reinforced commercial snowplow, stripped of its blade and retrofitted with a massive, solid steel ramming grille. It roared out of the darkness with terrifying speed, striking their armored SUV perfectly on the passenger side. The impact was catastrophic. The deafening crunch of crumpling steel and shattering reinforced glass drowned out even the thunder overhead. The sheer kinetic force of the ramming vehicle lifted the 3-ton armored SUV entirely off its left wheels. Ellie screamed as the cabin violently tilted, gravity inverted. The world outside the windows became a disorienting blur of rain, concrete, and the black abyss of the river. The SUV was shoved violently backward, skidding uncontrollably across the slick concrete. Silas slammed on the brakes, fighting the steering wheel with everything he had. But it was useless against the momentum of the heavier machine. With a sickening, metallic screech, the rear tires of the SUV slipped off the edge of the concrete pier. For one terrifying, suspended second, the massive vehicle teetered on the precipice. Ellie looked through the shattered windshield and saw the steel grille of the ramming vehicle backing away, leaving them to their fate. Then, the heavy engine block in the front of their vehicle dragged them down. The SUV plunged off the pier. The drop was only 15 feet. But hitting the surface of the freezing river felt like colliding with solid concrete. The impact knocked the breath completely from Ellie's lungs. The airbags did not deploy, the electrical systems instantly short-circuiting as the freezing. Pitch-black water swallowed the vehicle whole. The descent was immediate and terrifying. The heavy armor plating that had protected them from bullets was now a deadly anchor, dragging the vehicle down into the pitch black, freezing depths of the river with terrifying speed. Water instantly began pouring into the cabin through the spider-webbed cracks in the compromised windshield and the twisted passenger door. It was not just cold, it was a paralyzing, agonizing, bone-crushing chill that immediately sent Ellie's body into a state of physiological shock. "Ellie." Julian's voice cut through the darkness and the rushing roar of the water. The emergency backup lights flickered weakly, casting an eerie, pale green glow in the rapidly filling cabin. The water was already up to their waists and rising with terrifying velocity. Ellie was paralyzed, her muscles locking up from the freezing temperature, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Julian unbuckled himself and lunged across the slanted cabin, grabbing her by the shoulders. His large, calloused hands shook her slightly, forcing her panicked, wide eyes to lock onto his calm, steady gaze. "Look at me," Julian commanded, his voice a solid anchor in the swirling chaos. Eleanor, look at me. Do not panic. You have to conserve your oxygen. We are sinking, Ellie sobbed, her teeth chattering violently as the freezing water reached her chest. Julian, the doors won't open. The pressure. I know, Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He reached down into the freezing water, pulling a heavy tactical knife from his ankle sheath. He slammed the butt of the knife against the reinforced side window, but the thick, bulletproof glass did not even scratch. The armor that was designed to save them was now their tomb. The water rose to their collarbones. The pressure inside the cabin was becoming unbearable, making their ears pop and their chests ache. The pale green emergency lights flickered, threatening to plunge them into absolute, eternal darkness. Julian stopped hitting the side window. He turned back to Ellie. The ruthless cartel boss was entirely gone. In his place was a man stripped down to his most vulnerable, authentic core. The freezing water swirled around his neck, washing away the blood, the polished exterior. The monster he had pretended to be for decades. I built this empire on fear. Ellie, Julian whispered, the sound barely audible over the rush of the incoming water. He reached out, his freezing fingers cupping the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone with a desperate, heartbreaking tenderness. I thought it was armor. I thought it would protect me, but it is just dead weight. It is drowning us. Julian, please. Ellie cried, the freezing water licking at her chin. We have to break the glass. I will get you out, Julian promised, his icy blue eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering devotion. If we survive this, if I get you to the surface, I swear to you, I will change it all. I will tear down the syndicate. I will build you a new archive. I will spend the rest of my life making up for the darkness I brought into yours. The water reached their mouths. Take a deep breath, Julian commanded. Now, Ellie inhaled as deeply as her trembling lungs would allow, filling her chest with the last remaining pocket of stale air in the cabin. A split second later, the water swallowed them completely. The world went pitch black. The silence underwater was absolute and terrifying. Through the murky, freezing darkness, Ellie felt Julian move. He did not swim toward the side doors. He maneuvered his massive frame into the front seat, bracing his broad back against the driver's seat. He brought both of his heavy boots up against the center of the spider-webbed, compromised windshield. The glass had been severely weakened by the initial ramming impact. Julian unleashed a desperate, brutal kick. The water resistance slowed his movement, but the sheer, adrenaline-fueled power in his legs was immense. The windshield groaned. He kicked again, and again. His lungs were burning, his muscles screaming for oxygen, but he did not stop. With a sickening, muffled crunch, the reinforced windshield finally gave way, exploding outward into the dark river. The sudden rush of water equalized the pressure, but it also threatened to pull them out into the dangerous currents. Julian grabbed Ellie by the waist of her heavy, ruined crimson gown. He physically hauled her forward, pushing her through the jagged opening of the shattered windshield. Ellie scrambled through the opening, the jagged edges of the glass tearing at her skin, but she did not feel the pain. The freezing water had completely numbed her body. She kicked her legs, trying to swim upward toward the faint, distorted light of the surface. She turned back, reaching her hand out to pull Julian through the opening after her, but Julian was not following. Through the murky green gloom, Ellie saw the horrifying truth. When Julian had delivered the final, glass-shattering kick, the massive, crushed dashboard of the SUV had shifted. The twisted steel had collapsed downward, pinning Julian's right leg completely beneath the heavy engine block. He was trapped. Ellie's lungs screamed in agony. She swam back toward the windshield, grabbing his outstretched hand. She pulled with all of her remaining strength, her plump, soft fingers digging into his calloused flesh. She tried to leverage her weight to free him, refusing to let go. Julian looked at her through the dark water. His face was pale, his eyes wide and filled with a profound, tragic acceptance. He shook his head slowly. He knew he could not be freed. He was out of oxygen. He was out of time. He squeezed her hand one final time, a silent, heartbreaking goodbye. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, Julian ripped his hand out of her grasp. He placed both of his palms flat against her shoulders and shoved her backward, violently pushing her away from the sinking vehicle and up toward the surface. Ellie screamed, but the sound was lost to the water, a cascade of silver bubbles rushing from her mouth. She fought the upward momentum, trying desperately to swim back down to him, but her lungs were entirely depleted. Her vision was narrowing into a dark, suffocating tunnel. The survival instinct of her body took over, forcing her to kick her legs, propelling her toward the surface. As she ascended into the freezing darkness, Ellie looked down. The pale green emergency light of the SUV grew smaller and smaller, sinking deeper into the black, unforgiving abyss of the Chicago River. And then the light flickered and died completely. Julian Vance was gone. The world did not end with an explosion. It ended with a deafening, freezing silence. Eleanor Hayes breached the surface of the Chicago River with a violent, agonizing gasp. The freezing air rushed into her burning lungs like shattered glass. She thrashed wildly in the dark, churning water, completely disoriented. Blinded by the torrential rain and the suffocating darkness of the night, Julian, Ellie screamed, her voice a raw, shredded sound that was instantly swallowed by the roaring wind. Julian, she tried to dive back down. She tried to force her exhausted, freezing body beneath the surface to find him, to pull him from the twisted steel tomb, but her muscles refused to obey. The hypothermia was setting in rapidly, turning her limbs to lead. Her heavy, waterlogged crimson gown acted like an anchor, threatening to drag her back into the abyss. Strong hands suddenly grabbed her from behind, locking firmly under her arms. "I've got you. Stop fighting." Silas's voice roared in her ear over the sound of the storm. He had managed to escape through the shattered driver's side window before the dashboard collapsed. Silas hauled her backward through the freezing water, kicking desperately toward the concrete pylons of the pier. He dragged her up onto the rough, barnacle-encrusted concrete of the lower maintenance dock. Ellie collapsed onto the hard stone, coughing up brackish river water, her entire body shaking with violent, uncontrollable spasms. "Where is he?" Ellie choked out, grabbing the lapels of Silas's soaking wet tactical jacket. Her eyes were wide, dilated with absolute terror. "Silas, he's trapped. The dashboard, his leg. We have to go back down. We have to get him." Silas knelt on the concrete beside her, chest heaving, rain plastering his hair to his scarred forehead. He looked out at the churning, black surface of the river. The bubbles from the sinking SUV had long since ceased. The water was incredibly deep here, the current treacherously fast. "He's gone." "Ellie," Silas said. His voice was completely hollow, devoid of its usual hardened edge. It was the voice of a man stating an undeniable, horrific truth. "No," Ellie screamed, slamming her fists against Silas's chest. "No, you don't understand. He promised. He promised me he would change everything. You have to save him. You are his second in command. Do your job." Silas caught her wrists, his grip firm but strangely gentle. He looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with a heavy, profound sorrow. "The car is at the bottom of the river," Silas whispered, the rain masking the tears that leaked from his eyes. He was out of air. "Even if I could reach the bottom, I can't move an engine block with my bare hands. He is gone, Eleanor. Julian is dead." The words struck Ellie with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The fight instantly drained from her body. She went completely limp against the freezing concrete. The man who had seen her absolute worth when the rest of the world told her to shrink. The man who had knelt before her to bandage a scratch on her shoulder, completely disregarding his own bleeding wounds. The ruthless cartel boss who was willing to dismantle his entire violent empire simply because a plus-size archivist had demanded a world with dignity. He was dead. He had drowned in the freezing dark, trapped in a steel cage of his own making, sacrificing his final breath to push her to safety. A crushing, Absolute despair settled over Ellie's soul. It was a darkness far deeper and colder than the river she had just escaped. Within the span of a single hour, Marcus Thorne had burned her history to ash, and the river had swallowed her future. She had absolutely nothing left. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a city that had violently rejected her. Silas did not give her time to mourn. The distant wails from the sirens, likely Thorns, bought and paid for police units arriving to secure the perimeter cut through the storm. "We have to move," Silas said, pulling her to her feet. "Thorn will have men sweeping the docks. If they find you alive, they will finish the job. Julian died to keep you breathing. Do not make his sacrifice mean nothing." Those words were the only thing that forced Ellie to put one foot in front of the other. Silas draped his heavy, soaking wet tactical jacket over her trembling shoulders. He guided her through the shadows of the abandoned shipyard, avoiding the sweeping beams of the tactical vehicles searching the upper piers. They reached a rusted, unmarked chain-link fence on the far edge of the industrial park. Hidden behind a dilapidated storage shed was an old, nondescript sedan ghost car Silas kept stashed for absolute emergencies. Silas unlocked the car, shoved Ellie into the passenger seat, and cranked the ignition. He cranked the heater to the maximum. But the warm air blowing against Ellie's skin felt completely distant. She was numb. She stared out the window at the passing streetlights, her mind entirely blank. She did not cry. The grief was too massive, too overwhelming for tears. It was a suffocating pressure in her chest that made it difficult to draw a full breath. They drove in absolute silence for nearly an hour. Silas avoided all main highways, navigating the labyrinthine back roads of the Chicago suburbs. He constantly checked his mirrors, taking random turns to ensure they were not being followed. Ellie did not ask where they were going. It didn't matter. The world she knew was gone. The museum was ashes. Julian's was water. Eventually, Silas pulled the sedan into the gravel driveway of a small, isolated cabin hidden deep within the forested outskirts of the city. The safe house was completely off the grid. No cameras, no internet, no digital footprint. It was a place designed for ghosts to disappear. Silas cut the engine. The silence in the car was heavy and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof. "Come on," Silas said quietly, his voice tight. "Let's get inside. You need dry clothes before the hypothermia shuts down your organs completely." Ellie moved mechanically. She stepped out of the car, her ruined crimson dress heavy with freezing river water, her bare feet crunching against the gravel. She walked up the wooden steps to the porch. Silas unlocked the heavy steel-reinforced door of the cabin. He pushed it open, stepping inside to flip on a solitary, dim lamp in the corner of the small living room. The cabin was Spartan, smelling of dust, pine needles, and stale air. Ellie stepped inside, wrapping her arms around her stomach. She looked around the empty room, feeling the absolute hollow emptiness of her survival. Silas closed the heavy steel door behind her. The deadbolt slid into place with a loud, definitive, metallic clack. Then Silas turned around. He reached beneath his wet jacket, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He drew the weapon smoothly. He did not point it at the floor. He did not check the chamber. He raised the heavy black barrel of the gun, pointing it directly at the center of Eleanor's chest. Ellie froze. The numbness in her brain vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp spike of absolute confusion. She stared down the barrel of the weapon, then slowly raised her eyes to look at Silas's face. The hardened syndicate enforcer was weeping. Tears were streaming freely down Silas's scarred, exhausted face, mixing with the rain. His hand, the hand that had just pulled her from the freezing depths of the river, was trembling violently. "Silas," Ellie whispered, her voice cracking. What are you doing?" "I am so sorry." "Ellie," Silas choked out, his voice breaking under the weight of an unbearable agony. He gripped the gun with both hands to steady it, but his entire body was shaking. "God forgive me. I am so sorry." "Why?" Ellie asked. stepping backward until her spine hit the cold plaster wall of the cabin. The betrayal was so sudden, so entirely incomprehensible. It defied logic. He was your boss. He was your brother. We just watched him die. Julian is gone. Silas sobbed, the words tearing out of his throat like barbed wire. The syndicate is gone. But Marcus Thorne is still alive, and he knows exactly who you are. He knows you are the only one who can identify the offshore accounts and the shipping routes Julian acquired tonight. I don't know any of that, Ellie pleaded, raising her hands defensively. I am just an archivist. Silas, please. Put the gun down. It doesn't matter what you know, Silas said, shaking his head rapidly. Thorne wants you. He wants to parade Julian Vance's brilliant, beautiful wife through his cages to prove that nobody escapes him. Then let me run, Ellie begged, the sheer cruelty of the world finally breaking her composure. Give me the keys. I will disappear. You don't have to do this. Silas closed his eyes. A devastating, guttural sob escaped his lips. When he opened his eyes again, the conflict was gone, replaced by the dead, empty stare of a man who had already lost his soul. I can't let you run, Eleanor, Silas whispered into the dim, dusty air of the safe house. He cocked the hammer of the gun. The metallic click echoed loudly in the small room. Thorne sent me a video an hour before the dinner. He found my safe house. He found my family. Silas took a step closer, the barrel of the gun inches from Ellie's heart. I am not doing this for money. I am not doing this for the cartel, Silas wept, staring into the terrified eyes of the woman he had just saved. I'm sorry. Ellie, Thorne has my daughter, and if I don't deliver you to him tonight, he is going to send her back to me in pieces. Hope is the cruelest weapon a monster can wield. Eleanor Hayes had read that sentiment in the diaries of prisoners of war, in the archived letters of those who had suffered through the darkest chapters of human history. She had archived their pain, meticulously preserving their words in climate-controlled rooms. But she had never truly understood the absolute, agonizing weight of it until the heavy steel doors of Marcus Thorne's underground compound slammed shut behind her. The drive from Silas's safe house to the cartel's black site had been a blur of suffocating silence and crushing betrayal. Silas had bound her wrists with heavy zip ties, his hands shaking so violently he had barely been able to pull the plastic taut. He had not spoken another word to her. He had simply driven, a dead man behind the wheel, sacrificing her life to purchase the survival of his daughter. Ellie did not fight him. The fight had been drowned in the freezing, black waters of the Chicago River alongside the only man who had ever truly seen her. Thorne's compound was located beneath an abandoned meatpacking plant on the industrial outskirts of the city. It smelled of ammonia, old blood, and damp concrete. When Silas dragged her out of the vehicle and into the blinding glare of the subterranean loading dock, Marcus Thorne was waiting. Thorne was a man who wore his cruelty like a tailored suit. He was tall, impeccably groomed, and possessed a face that would have been handsome if not for the dead, reptilian coldness in his eyes. He stood flanked by a dozen heavily armed mercenaries. Silas, Thorne greeted, his voice smooth and dripping with mock sympathy. You look terrible, but I see you brought me my prize. Silas shoved Ellie forward. She stumbled, her bare feet scraping against the rough concrete, the ruined, waterlogged silk of her crimson gown hanging off her shivering frame. I brought her, Silas rasped, his voice devoid of any emotion. Where is my family? Thorne snapped his fingers. A heavy iron door opened to the right. Two guards hauled a terrified woman and a crying little girl out into the harsh fluorescent light. Silas let out a ragged, agonizing breath, taking a step toward them. But Thorne's men instantly raised their rifles, aiming directly at the child's head. Thorne clicked his tongue. Not yet, Silas. A transaction requires verification. I need to know the archivist is as valuable as you claim. Thorne stepped closer to Ellie. He circled her slowly, like a predator evaluating a wounded animal. He looked at her wet, tangled hair, her tear-streaked face, and the heavy curves of her body beneath the ruined silk. He sneered. a look of profound, arrogant disgust. This is the lioness of the Vance Syndicate. Thorne mocked. Reaching out to grab her chin with a bruising grip, Julian Vance went to war over a fat, delusional librarian. He must have been truly desperate to use you as his shield. Ellie jerked her face away from his grip, even in her crushing grief. The fierce, unapologetic dignity that defined her flared to life. He did not use me, Ellie spat, her dark eyes locking onto Thorne's. He died protecting me. Something a parasite like you could never understand. Thorne laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Oh, my sweet, naive girl. You actually believe that, don't you? You think you are the tragic heroine of a romance novel. Take her to my office. Let's show the archivist the true history of tonight. Two massive guards grabbed Ellie by the arms, dragging her away from the loading dock and down a long, dimly lit corridor. She was shoved violently into a stark, concrete room furnished only with a metal table and a single chair. Thorne entered a moment later, carrying a manila folder. He tossed it onto the metal table in front of her. Open it, Thorne commanded, leaning against the doorframe, watching her with sadistic anticipation. Ellie's hands were trembling violently. Because her wrists were bound in front of her, she managed to flip the heavy cover of the folder open. Inside were documents, dozens of them. They bore the official letterhead of the Vance Syndicate, signed in Julian's unmistakable, sharp handwriting. What is this? Ellie whispered, her eyes scanning the complex legal jargon. That is reality, Thorne said smoothly. Those are the insurance policies Julian took out on your life 3 days ago. Notice the beneficiary. It's a shell company owned by Silas. Julian knew the dinner was a trap. Eleanor. He knew I would target the woman sitting next to him. He dressed you in a bright red dress to ensure you were the center of attention. You were bait. No, Ellie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No, you forged these. He bought my archive. He protected me in the shootout. He protected his investment until he could finalize the offshore transfers. Thorne countered, stepping forward to flip to the next page. Look at this one. The architectural blueprints of your archive. He didn't just want the subterranean maps. He authorized the demolition of your building. He paid my men to burn it down tonight while he was with you, ensuring the police would be entirely distracted with a massive fire while he extracted himself from the city. Ellie stared at the document. It was a demolition order, complete with Julian's signature and a wire transfer receipt to a known arsonist crew. The dates matched. The signatures matched. He played you, Eleanor, Thorne whispered, leaning down so his mouth was inches from her ear. He found a woman who spent her life being ignored, a woman desperate to be seen, and he made you feel like a queen for 24 hours. He told you exactly what you wanted to hear about dignity and respect. And while you were busy falling in love with a monster, he burned your life's work to the ground to cover his tracks. You aren't a queen. You're a pawn who outlived her usefulness. The final pillar of Eleanor's strength shattered. It was a physical sensation, an agonizing rupture deep within her chest. The documents blurred beneath her tears. The man who had touched her face with such reverence. The man who had promised to change his entire world for her. It had all been a calculated, sociopathic lie. He had not died a hero in the river. He had likely orchestrated the crash. Escaping while she drowned in the illusion of his love, she let out a devastating, gut-wrenching sob, her bound hands coming up to cover her face. Her fundamental belief in human goodness, in the redeeming power of compassion, was utterly crushed under the weight of Thorne's fabricated evidence. She had fought so hard to take up space, only to realize she had merely been occupying the kill zone Julian had designed for her. Take her down to the holding pens, Thorne ordered his guards, thoroughly satisfied with the absolute psychological destruction he had inflicted. Put her with the inventory. We shipped them all out to the overseas buyers at dawn. Ellie offered no resistance. She was completely hollowed out, a ghost haunting her own body. The guards dragged her down a terrifying, spiral staircase deep into the bowels of the facility. The smell of ammonia was replaced by the sickening stench of unwashed bodies, fear and human despair. She was thrown violently into a massive, freezing iron cage. The heavy door clanged shut, the deadbolt locking with a sound of utter finality. The cage was practically in darkness, illuminated only by a single, flickering bulb in the corridor. As Ellie's eyes adjusted, she realized she was not alone. Huddled in the corners of the freezing, damp cell were dozens of women. They were dressed in rags, their faces bruised, their eyes completely hollow. They were human trafficking victims, waiting to be sold into living nightmares. Ellie collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. She curled her knees against her chest, wrapping her arms around her trembling body. She was going to die here, and worse. She deserved it. She had been arrogant enough to believe that a cartel boss could possess a human heart. She had been foolish enough to believe that her compassion could conquer a world built on blood. She closed her eyes, praying for the freezing temperature to simply stop her heart and end the agony. Hours passed in suffocating silence. The darkness of human nature overwhelmed her completely. There was no light, there was no justice, there was only power, and those who were crushed beneath it. Then she felt a hesitant, incredibly light touch on her shoulder. Ellie slowly opened her swollen, tear-stained eyes. Kneeling beside her on the freezing concrete was a young girl, no older than 19. The girl's face was badly bruised, her lips split, her thin frame shivering violently in a torn cotton dress. The girl looked at Ellie's ruined crimson gown, then looked up into Ellie's devastated eyes. The girl's hand was trembling, but she held out a small, torn piece of a dirty wool blanket. She was offering Ellie half of the only warmth she possessed. Ellie stared at the blanket, her breath hitching. "Keep it," Ellie rasped, her voice completely broken. "You need it." The girl shook her head slowly. She pressed the fabric into Ellie's bound hands. "It's okay," the young girl whispered, her voice barely a breath, carrying a heavy Eastern European accent. "You don't have to be afraid." Ellie looked at the bruised, broken girl offering comfort in the middle of hell. "Why are you helping me? I can't do anything for you. I'm nobody." The girl offered a small, broken but incredibly genuine smile. She reached out and gently touched the heavy silk of Ellie's torn sleeve. "The guards talk," the girl whispered. "They said you stood in front of a gun at the fancy club tonight. They said you saved the waitress. She is my cousin. She got a message to my family before she ran." Ellie froze, her heart skipping a violent beat. The girl leaned closer, her dark eyes filled with a sudden, fierce light that defied the iron cage around them. "My cousin told me what you said to the man who tried to hit her. I repeat it to myself in the dark so I don't forget I am human." The girl took a deep breath, reciting the words like a sacred prayer. "Human life has dignity. You are not a punching bag. You are perfectly safe." The words struck Ellie with the force of a lightning bolt. It was an exact echo. The compassion she had thrown into the dark, violent world hours ago had not died. It had traveled. It had survived the gunfire, the fire, and the betrayal. It had found its way down into this pitch-black cell to pull her back from the edge of the abyss. Thorne had lied. The documents were a brilliant, calculated forgery designed to break her mind because Thorne knew her mind was the most dangerous weapon she possessed. Julian had not set her up. A man who forged demolition orders did not sacrifice his final breath to push her out of a sinking car. Julian's sacrifice had been real. His love had been real. And she was Eleanor Hayes. She did not break. She did not shrink. A fierce, burning heat ignited deep within Ellie's chest, melting the freezing despair that had paralyzed her. The fire returned to her eyes, sharper and more lethal than ever before. She sat up, accepting the piece of blanket and wrapping it around her shivering shoulders. She looked at the young girl, then looked around the cage at the dozens of terrified women watching them from the shadows. "What is your name?" Ellie asked, her voice losing its broken rasp, replaced by the commanding, authoritative tone of a woman who was preparing to go to war. "Anya," the girl whispered. "Listen to me. Anya, Ellie said, projecting her voice just enough for the other women in the cell to hear. We are not inventory. We are not going to be shipped anywhere. We are going to walk out of this compound tonight. The women murmured, a wave of fearful skepticism washing through the cage. The guards have machine guns. An older woman whispered from the corner, the doors are solid iron. We can't fight them. We don't have to fight them, Ellie said, her brilliant mind rapidly analyzing the structural weaknesses of the underground facility she had observed on her way in. We just have to outsmart them. I need everyone to stand up. Find anything you can use as a weapon. A loose pipe, a piece of wire, a heavy shoe. When the door opens, you do not run blindly. You stay behind me. Before Anya could ask how Ellie planned to open a locked iron vault, the entire compound plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The main power grid had been violently severed. Screams of confusion erupted from the guards in the distant corridors. The emergency backup generators shrieked, struggling to engage, bathing the corridor outside their cell in a sickly, flickering red strobe light. Through the flashing crimson illumination, Ellie saw a massive guard running down the hall toward their cell, raising his radio to call for backup. Suddenly, a massive shadow detached itself from the ceiling pipes directly above the guard. The guard did not even have time to scream. The shadow dropped on him with terrifying, lethal precision. A large, muscular arm wrapped around the guard's throat in a brutal chokehold, dragging him violently backward into the absolute darkness of the blind spot between the flashing lights. There was a sickening crack, and the guard's body hit the concrete floor, completely motionless. The women in the cage gasped, retreating in terror. But Ellie stepped forward, pressing her face against the cold iron bars. Her heart was hammering a frantic, impossible rhythm against her ribs. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Stepping into the flickering red light, he was soaking wet, his expensive clothes torn and covered in river mud and blood. A crude, makeshift tourniquet was tied tightly around his upper thigh. He was limping heavily, breathing with ragged, agonizing gasps. But his icy blue eyes were blazing with an unholy, unstoppable fury. Julian Vance had returned from the dead. He staggered to the cage, his massive hands gripping the iron bars. He looked at Ellie, his chest heaving. Without a single word, he reached through the bars. His scarred, calloused hand found hers. With his other hand, Julian slipped the heavy iron key ring he had just taken off the dead guard through the bars, pressing it directly into Ellie's palm. A cornered lioness does not whimper. She memorizes the faces of her hunters. Eleanor Hayes gripped the cold iron keys, the jagged metal biting into her soft palm. The flickering red emergency lights of the subterranean compound painted Julian Vance's face in harsh, bloody shadows. He looked like a demon dragged straight from the depths of hell, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his massive frame shivering from the freezing river water, his leg heavily wrapped in a blood-soaked tourniquet. But to Ellie, he was the most magnificent sight in the history of the world. She did not hesitate. Her bound hands fumbled clumsily with the heavy iron ring, but she found the master key, slotted it into the deadbolt, and turned. The heavy mechanism groaned, and the iron door swung open. Julian practically fell into the cage, his injured leg buckling beneath him. Ellie caught him, throwing her arms around his broad, wet shoulders, absorbing his massive weight. For a fraction of a second, the rest of the world ceased to exist. Julian buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent as if it were the only oxygen left on earth. He wrapped his arms around her thick waist, holding her with a desperate, crushing intensity that proved Marcus Thorne's forged documents were nothing but cheap lies. "You're alive," Ellie choked out, tears of absolute joy mixing with the dirt on her face. "How?" Silas left an emergency oxygen canister strapped to the undercarriage of the SUV. Julian rasped, his voice rough from swallowing river water. "I managed to break the dashboard leverage point just before the water pressure crushed the cabin. I tracked Thorne's vehicles here. I told you, Eleanor." There is no force on this earth that is going to make me let you go. He pulled back, his icy eyes sweeping over her ruined dress and bound wrists. A terrifying, murderous rage flashed across his face. He drew his tactical knife and sliced the heavy zip ties off her wrists in one swift motion. We have exactly 3 minutes before the backup generators restore full power to the security doors. Julian commanded, his cartel instincts taking over. I have an extraction vehicle waiting at the north access tunnel. We move fast. Stay behind me. Julian turned to leave the cell, expecting Ellie to follow blindly. Instead, Ellie stood her ground. She turned around and faced the dozens of terrified, trembling women huddled in the shadows of the cage. No, Ellie said, her voice echoing with absolute authority. Julian stopped dead in his tracks, turning back to look at her in shock. Eleanor, this is a black site. We are surrounded by mercenaries. We have to go. I am not leaving them, Ellie stated, her dark eyes locking onto his with an unyielding, fierce determination. I told you, Julian, human life is not currency. I am not walking out of hell and leaving 50 women to burn in it. We leave with all of them. Or we do not leave at all. Julian stared at the beautiful, stubborn, spectacularly courageous woman in front of him. In his world, saving oneself was the only rule. But Ellie was fundamentally rewriting every law of his universe. He looked at the terrified women, then looked back at his queen. Julian Vance nodded once. Then we need a bigger exit strategy. I memorized the evacuation map posted in the loading dock on my way in, Ellie said rapidly, her brilliant archivist mind perfectly recalling the complex schematic. The north access tunnel is a choke point. They will heavily guard it once the power kicks back on. But there is a freight elevator shaft on the east wing that connects directly to the old meatpacking rail spur on the surface. If we can get them to the surface, they can vanish into the rail yards. The east wing is the armory, Julian warned, checking the magazine of his stolen sidearm. It will be heavily fortified. Then we don't sneak past them, Ellie said, a dangerous, tactical fire lighting up her eyes. We create a diversion they cannot ignore. Ellie turned to Anya and the other women. Everyone, link arms. Do not let go of the woman next to you. If you fall, we pick you up. We move as one unit. The breakout was a masterclass in chaotic, cinematic warfare. Julian took the point, a lethal limping specter of vengeance. He moved with terrifying efficiency, neutralizing the guards in the lower corridors with suppressed gunfire and brutal hand-to-hand takedowns. Clearing the path through the flickering red gloom, Ellie commanded the rear, her booming, theatrical voice directing the panicked women, keeping the formation tight, preventing anyone from being left behind. She was a general leading an army of the forgotten. They reached the intersection of the east wing. Down the corridor, heavily armed mercenaries were rallying outside the armory, preparing to sweep the lower levels. Wait here, Julian whispered, pressing Ellie back against the concrete wall. He unclipped a tear gas grenade he had scavenged from a fallen guard. But instead of throwing it at the mercenaries, Julian hurled it directly into the facility's central ventilation intake shaft located in the ceiling above them. The grenade detonated with a hollow thump. Within seconds, the toxic, blinding white smoke was sucked into the massive industrial fans and aggressively pumped into every single room, office, and corridor of the compound. Absolute panic erupted. The mercenaries down the hall began choking, stumbling blindly in the thick smoke. Their tactical coordination completely shattered. Move, 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 Ellie yelled, pulling her scarf over her mouth and leading the line of women directly through the blinding smoke, bypassing the incapacitated guards. They reached the massive, rusted doors of the freight elevator. Julian hacked the control panel, overriding the security lockout. The heavy metal grate hauled open. Ellie shoved the women inside, packing them tightly into the massive industrial lift. Julian stepped in last, hitting the ascent button just as Thorne's elite shooters breached the smoke, firing blindly toward the elevator. Bullets sparked off the heavy iron grate as the elevator violently lurched upward. carrying them out of the subterranean hell and toward the surface. The doors opened to the freezing, pouring rain of the Chicago night. They were standing on an abandoned, overgrown rail spur behind the meatpacking plant. The extraction point is half a mile north, Julian yelled over the storm. Grabbing his hand, they ran. 50 women, led by a bleeding cartel boss and a plus-size archivist in a ruined ball gown, sprinting desperately through the rain-swept rail yards. The adrenaline masked the pain in Julian's leg and the freezing cold tearing at Ellie's skin. They crested a small ridge of gravel and saw it. The extraction point. It was an abandoned, massive train station from the 1930s, its vaulted glass ceiling shattered, its platforms overgrown with weeds. But idling silently on the tracks was a massive, modern freight train, its massive diesel engine humming with raw power. Standing by the open doors of a pristine passenger car attached to the rear were heavily armed men wearing the Vance Syndicate crest, Julian's loyalists. The men who had refused to believe their boss was dead. Get them on board, Julian roared, waving his men forward. The Syndicate soldiers did not hesitate. They rushed forward, helping the exhausted, freezing women up onto the train. The women wept with relief, collapsing into the warm, secure leather seats of the transport. Anya turned back at the door, catching Ellie's eye. The young girl pressed her hand to her heart, tears streaming down her bruised face, mouthing a silent, desperate thank you. Ellie nodded, a profound, overwhelming sense of victory washing over her. She had done it. She had pulled them from the dark. The train leaves in 60 seconds. Julian's lead lieutenant shouted over the rain. Boss, we need to get you to a medic. Your leg is losing too much blood. Secure the perimeter until the train is moving, Julian ordered, leaning heavily against a concrete pillar, his face pale and drawn. He looked at Ellie, a tired, genuine smile cracking his hardened features. You did it, Eleanor. You saved them. We saved them, Ellie corrected, stepping close and wrapping her arms around his waist to support his weight. It's over, Julian, let's go home. But as the words left her mouth, a sudden, blinding light violently illuminated the entire train platform. Massive industrial floodlights, mounted on the rusted girders above, snapped on with a deafening electronic crack. The sudden brilliance blinded Ellie and Julian, forcing them to shield their eyes. The heavy, rhythmic sound of slow clapping echoed through the cavernous, empty station. As Ellie's eyes adjusted to the glaring light, the absolute horror of their situation slammed into her like a physical blow. This was not a clean escape. It was false security. They had walked directly into the final trap. Standing at the far end of the platform, completely untouched by the rain, was Marcus Thorne. He was smiling a predatory, satisfied smile. But Thorne was not alone. Kneeling on the wet concrete in front of Thorne were a woman and a little girl. They were bound, gagged, and sobbing in sheer terror. It was Silas's family, and standing directly behind Julian, stepping out from the shadows of the concrete pillar with a weapon raised, was Silas. The heavy, cold steel barrel of Silas's gun was pressed directly against the base of Julian Vance's spine. Checkmate. Thorne's voice boomed over the station's rusted PA system, echoing mockingly over the sound of the idling train. Ellie froze, her blood turning to ice. The Syndicate soldiers on the train immediately raised their rifles, aiming at Thorne. But Thorne's hidden snipers on the catwalks above racked their bolts, creating a deadly, unwinnable Mexican standoff. Tell your men to lower their weapons, Julian, Thorne commanded, stepping closer to Silas's kneeling wife, resting his hand casually on her trembling shoulder. Or the little girl gets a bullet in her brain before you can even blink. Julian's face went entirely blank. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not fight Silas's hold. He slowly raised his left hand, signaling his men on the train to stand down. Let the train go. Thorne, Julian said, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried perfectly over the rain. You have me. Let the women go. Oh, I intend to. Thorne laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. I don't care about the inventory anymore. I care about the spectacle. I care about the message. Thorn walked down the platform, stopping 10 feet from where Silas held Julian at gunpoint. Thorn reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out a fresh, fully loaded magazine. He tossed it onto the wet concrete at Silas's feet. You did good, Silas, Thorn said smoothly, his eyes locked onto Julian's back. You delivered the bait, and the rat followed. Now let's finish the transaction. Thorn pointed a silver revolver directly at the head of Silas's little girl. The child squeezed her eyes shut, a muffled scream escaping her gag. Shoot the boss. Silas, Thorn ordered, his voice dripping with sadistic joy. Put a bullet directly through his spine, or watch your little girl die. True power is not measured by who you can kill, but by who you can save without firing a single shot. The abandoned train station was a cathedral of rusted iron and shattered glass, illuminated with the blinding, aggressive glare of Marcus Thorne's industrial floodlights. The heavy, rhythmic hum of the idling freight train was completely drowned out by the deafening roar of the torrential Chicago rain beating against the corrugated steel roof. Eleanor Hayes stood perfectly still, her breath crystallizing in the freezing air, her heart slamming against her ribs with the force of a battering ram. The standoff was absolute. Silas, the man who had pulled her from the freezing depths of the river, stood directly behind Julian Vance. The cold steel barrel of his weapon pressed flush against the base of Julian's spine. Across the wet concrete platform, Thorne smiled his reptilian smile, the silver barrel of his revolver resting casually against the temple of Silas's weeping, bound daughter. Shoot the boss, Silas. Thorne's voice echoed through the station's rusted PA system, dripping with a sadistic, triumphant joy. Put a bullet directly through his spine, or watch your little girl die. The choice is yours. Loyalty to a dead empire, or the life of your blood. Ellie watched the muscles in Julian's broad back tense. In the old world, the world governed by the ruthless laws of the Vance Syndicate, this was the exact moment Julian would execute a lethal countermaneuver. He was faster than Silas. He could easily drop, pivot, and disarm his second-in-command before Silas could pull the trigger. But doing so would undoubtedly cause Thorne to flinch. And Thorne's finger was resting heavily on a hair trigger. If Julian fought back, the little girl would die. Julian slowly raised his hands in the air, his palms open, completely surrendering his defensive posture. Julian, no. Silas choked out, tears mixing with the rain on his scarred face. His hands were shaking so violently the barrel of his gun rattled against Julian's wet jacket. Please, boss. Draw your weapon. Fight me. Don't make me execute you. I am not fighting you. Silas. Julian's voice resonated through the cavernous station. It was remarkably calm, devoid of anger, devoid of the icy cruelty that had defined him for decades. You are a father protecting your child. You are doing exactly what you are supposed to do. Thorne laughed, a sharp, barking sound of disbelief. Look at this, the great Julian Vance, the apex predator of Chicago, suddenly discovering his conscience at the end of a gun. It is pathetic. You are weak, Julian. You let a woman soften your edges. And now you are going to bleed out on this filthy concrete because of it. Drop the gun, Silas, Julian commanded softly, entirely ignoring Thorne's taunts. He did not turn around. He spoke directly to the shattered soul of his oldest friend. You know Thorne. You know how his mind works. If you shoot me, you become a liability. He will not let a man who just assassinated a syndicate boss walk away. He will kill you. And then he will sell your wife and daughter to the overseas buyers anyway. Your compliance does not buy their freedom. It only guarantees your death. Silas let out a raw, agonizing sob. He knew Julian's was right. But the visual of Thorne's gun pressed against his daughter's head overrode every logical instinct he possessed. I don't have a choice, Silas wept, his finger tightening incrementally on the trigger. I'm sorry. God, I am so sorry. There is always a choice, Julian replied, his voice rising, carrying a profound, absolute authority. Without warning, Julian reached down with his left hand, drew his heavy tactical sidearm from his shoulder holster, and tossed it away. The heavy weapon clattered loudly across the wet concrete, sliding into the darkness of the tracks. He was entirely unarmed. He had completely stripped himself of his armor, his violence, and his terrifying reputation. I built an empire on fear, and it cost me everything, Julian said, his eyes locking with Ellie's across the short distance. The look he gave her was filled with absolute devotion, a silent promise that he was keeping his word. He was dismantling the dark. He turned his attention back to Thorn. I am ending the cycle tonight, Marcus. I will not spill another drop of blood to protect my throne. The Empire is dead. Thorn's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine, furious confusion. He could not comprehend a worldview where power was surrendered voluntarily. He was a creature of absolute malice. And Julian's refusal to play the game broke the psychological control he thought he held. You are a fool, Thorn roared, his composure cracking. He gripped the little girl's hair tighter, raising the silver revolver. If you won't die like a boss, you will die like a coward watching this brat bleed. Thorn swung the weapon away from the girl's head, pointing it directly at Julian's chest, intending to execute him personally. No, Silas screamed, realizing Thorn's betrayal. But Julian was already moving. He did not dive for cover. He did not lunge for Thorn's throat. With a sudden, explosive burst of speed, completely ignoring the agonizing pain in his torn leg, Julian threw his massive body forward, diving directly between Marcus Thorn and the terrified little girl. The gunshot was deafening. The heavy caliber bullet struck Julian high in the left shoulder, the kinetic impact spinning his massive frame violently in the air. Before he crashed onto the wet concrete, Julian, Ellie screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. But Ellie was not the woman she had been yesterday. She was not the helpless archivist watching her building burn. She was the lioness who had orchestrated a mass prison break. And she had spent the entire agonizing standoff analyzing the architectural environment of the rusted train station. Directly above Thorn's head hung a massive, cast-iron railway lantern, secured to a rusted steel stanchion by a decaying chain. As Thorn fired the shot, his attention was momentarily fixed on Julian's falling body. In that microscopic window of distraction, Ellie moved. She grabbed a heavy, discarded iron crowbar resting against the concrete pillar beside her. She swung it upward with every ounce of physical strength she possessed, the heavy muscles of her arms contracting violently. She did not strike Thorn. She struck the rusted, decaying chain of the lantern. The weakened metal shattered upon impact. The massive, 100-pound iron lantern dropped from the ceiling like an anvil. It struck Marcus Thorn directly on his right shoulder and the side of his head. The impact was catastrophic. Thorn's collarbone snapped with a sickening crunch, and the sheer weight of the iron drove him violently to the ground. His silver revolver skittered uselessly across the wet pavement. Chaos erupted on the platform. Silas charged forward, falling to his knees and wrapping his arms fiercely around his weeping wife and daughter, shielding them with his own body. Thorn's snipers in the rafters hesitated, completely disoriented by the sudden, brutal incapacitation of their leader and the sheer unpredictability of the targets below. Ellie dropped the crowbar and sprinted toward Julian. She slid onto her knees beside him on the wet concrete. His midnight blue tuxedo was torn and heavily stained with fresh blood, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Julian, Ellie choked out, pressing both of her hands fiercely against the gunshot wound on his shoulder to stem the bleeding. Stay with me. Look at me. Julian blinked up at her, his icy blue eyes hazy with pain, but a faint, incredibly beautiful smile touched his lips. I didn't shoot him. Eleanor, I kept my word. I know, Ellie wept, her tears falling onto his pale face. You kept your word. You are a good man. You are a king. A few feet away, Marcus Thorn groaned, attempting to push himself up from beneath the heavy iron lantern with his uninjured arm. His face was a bloody mask of fury. Julian's syndicate lieutenants, having witnessed Thorn fire at a child and their boss take the bullet, finally broke their restraint. They leaped off the train, their assault rifles raised, forming a lethal, inescapable circle around the fallen cartel leader. The clicking of a dozen safeties being disengaged echoed ominously through the station. "Execute him," the lead lieutenant snarled, aiming his weapon directly at Thorne's forehead. No, the command was weak, breathless, but it carried the absolute, unquestionable authority of Julian Vance. Julian struggled to sit up, leaning heavily against Ellie's soft, warm curves for support. He looked at his men, then looked down at the broken, bleeding monster on the floor. "We do not execute him," Julian ordered, his voice steadying. "We are not this anymore, if we put a bullet in his head. We are just maintaining the graveyard. We break the wheel tonight." The lieutenants hesitated, their ingrained cartel instincts warring against their absolute loyalty to the man who had just taken a bullet for a traitor's child. "Look at the street," Julian said, gesturing toward the main entrance of the station with a bloody hand. Through the shattered glass windows of the Grand Concourse, the pitch-black Chicago night was suddenly painted in violent flashes of red and blue. The wail of a dozen sirens pierced the sound of the storm. Massive, armored FBI tactical vehicles smashed through the chain-link perimeter fences. Heavily armed federal agents swarming the loading docks and the main entrances. "I made a call before I broke into the compound," Julian explained, looking up at Ellie with a profound, quiet peace in his eyes. "I gave them Thorne's offshore account numbers, the GPS coordinates of his human trafficking black sites, and the ledgers proving his extortion rings. I gave them everything." Ellie stared at him in awe. He had not just planned a rescue mission. He had orchestrated the legal, absolute destruction of Marcus Thorne's entire empire, ensuring Thorne would rot in a federal supermax prison for the rest of his miserable life, completely stripped of his power and his dignity. FBI agents flooded the platform, their tactical flashlights cutting through the gloom. They quickly secured Thorne's snipers in the rafters, who surrendered without firing a shot. Realizing their paymaster's was finished, a team of agents surrounded Thorne, dragging him out from under the iron lantern and violently clicking heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Thorne looked back at Julian, his reptilian eyes burning with a hateful, impotent rage. "You are a dead man, Vance. The other families will tear you apart for working with the feds." "Let them try," Julian replied softly, entirely unfazed. "The Vance Syndicate no longer exists. I am just a legitimate businessman now." As the paramedics rushed the platform with trauma kits and stretchers, Julian looked up at Ellie. Her gorgeous crimson dress was ruined, her hair was a tangled mess, and she was covered in soot, rain, and his blood. But to Julian, she was the most radiant, powerful entity in the universe. "The Empire is dead," Julian whispered, reaching up to gently cup her cheek with his uninjured hand. "Are you ready to build something new?" Ellie leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, a brilliant, beautiful smile breaking through her tears. "I am an archivist. Building things that last is exactly what I do." They told the bride she needed a slimming corset to survive the flash photography of the cameras. Eleanor Hayes fired them all. 6 months later, the violent storm that hadn't threatened to consume the Chicago underworld was nothing more than a fading memory, archived and buried under a mountain of federal indictments. True to his word, Julian Vance had legally and meticulously dismantled his criminal empire. He had transitioned his vast wealth into a massive, legitimate global shipping conglomerate. But more importantly, he had funded a sprawling, heavily protected foundation dedicated to the rehabilitation and education of human trafficking survivors, providing Anya and the other women the safety and resources they needed to reclaim their lives. He had also kept his most personal promise. In the heart of the city, a magnificent new building was nearing completion. It was a state-of-the-art facility, constructed with fireproof materials and climate-controlled vaults. It was the new Chicago Historical Archive, and Ellie was its undisputed director. But today, the only architecture Ellie cared about Was the structural integrity of the grand ballroom at the Drake Hotel? Absolutely not. Ellie's booming, theatrical voice echoed across the gilded bridal suite, halting a panicked team of seamstresses in their tracks. She pointed a manicured, plump finger at the lead stylist, a severe woman holding a rigid, heavily boned foundation garment. If you come near me with that medieval torture device, I will throw it out the window. I specifically ordered a gown that breathes, not a cage. The stylist clutched her pearls, looking horrified. But Miss Hayes, the press will be downstairs. The society columns are calling this the wedding of the decade. A custom gown of this magnitude requires structural support to minimize the waistline and flatter your proportions for the cameras. Ellie walked slowly toward the stylist, the sheer, unyielding force of her presence forcing the older woman to take a physical step back. Ellie's confidence had only magnified over the last 6 months. She had not lost a single pound, nor had she ever attempted to. She had moved into Julian's rebuilt penthouse, bringing her vibrant, unapologetic energy into his once sterile world, completely transforming it into a home filled with warmth, laughter, and stacks of historical texts. Listen to me very carefully, Ellie said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying calm. I do not want to be minimized. I do not want to create an optical illusion for a magazine. I am a fat, spectacular woman who is about to marry the man she loves. And I am going to take up every single inch of the aisle. Put the corset in the trash. The stylist swallowed hard, practically tossing the garment onto a nearby chair before fleeing the room. 2 hours later, the heavy oak doors of the Drake Hotel ballroom were sealed. The room was packed with a bizarre, thrilling collision of Ellie and Julian's two worlds. Federal prosecutors sat next to reformed syndicate lieutenants. Museum curators chatted with legitimate shipping magnates. Silas sat in the front row, holding his little girl in his lap. Julian had forgiven him, recognizing that true loyalty meant protecting one's family above all else. Silas now ran the security division for the legitimate shipping company, a man finally at peace. At the altar, Julian stood waiting. He wore a flawless, midnight blue tuxedo, looking incredibly handsome. His shoulder had fully healed, leaving only a faint scar that Ellie kissed every single morning. He was no longer the cold, dead-eyed predator of the underworld. He was a man deeply, profoundly alive. His hands, usually so steady, were clasped tightly in front of him, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he stared at the doors at the back of the room. The string quartet shifted into a sweeping, dramatic arrangement. The heavy doors swung open, and the entire room collectively lost its breath. Eleanor did not walk down the aisle. She commanded it. She had designed the dress herself, calling in favors from theatrical costume designers. It was a masterpiece of heavy, luminous ivory Duchess satin. The gown featured a dramatic off-the-shoulder neckline that proudly displayed her lush curves and full cleavage. It cinched gently at her natural waist before exploding into a voluminous, structured ball gown skirt embroidered with subtle, shimmering gold thread instead of a traditional veil. She wore a magnificent sheer silk tulle cape that trailed 10 feet behind her, catching the draft and billowing like a queen's mantle. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. She looked like a woman who owned the world. When Julian saw her, the tears he had never allowed himself to shed in his previous life welled in his icy blue eyes. He took a step forward, completely abandoning protocol, unable to wait for her to reach him. Ellie smiled, her dark eyes locking onto his. Walking down the aisle to the man who had hired her for a fake dinner and ended up surrendering his entire soul to her. Julian took her soft, plump hands in his calloused ones. "You are a vision," he whispered hoarsely, completely ignoring the hundreds of people watching them. "You broke down my walls and demanded a better room. I don't deserve you." "I know," Ellie whispered back, a wicked, triumphant twinkle in her eye. "But you are going to spend the rest of your life trying." The ceremony was a testament to their survival. When it came time for the vows, They spoke of the darkness they had dismantled and the light they had chosen to build. You taught me that true power isn't about the fear you instill in others, but the love you are brave enough to protect, Julian said, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. Raw and unshielded, I am yours, completely and forever. Ellie wiped a tear from his cheek. You gave me the stage, Julian, and you never once asked me to hide who I was. Promised to be your partner, your equal, and the woman who will always stand by your side. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Julian pulled Ellie into his arms, his hand spanning her wide, glorious waist, and kissed her with a consuming, passionate reverence that brought the entire room to its feet in a thunderous standing ovation. Years later, the Chicago Historical Archive stood as a beacon of knowledge and preservation in the city. The grand opening of the new exhibit hall was completely packed. The exhibition was dedicated to the forgotten women of history, the activists, the laborers, the queens who had shaped the world from the shadows. Julian Vance stood near the back of the massive, sunlit atrium. He wore a sharp suit, his hair slightly silvered at the temples, a look of profound, quiet contentment on his face. He watched his wife across the room. Ellie was giving a tour to a group of local high school students. She wore a vibrant emerald green dress that hugged her heavy curves perfectly. She was speaking with that familiar, booming, theatrical passion, bringing the dusty pages of history vividly to life. As the group moved toward the next gallery, a young girl lingered behind. She was a plus-size teenager, her shoulders hunched forward, wearing a baggy gray sweater in a clear, heartbreaking attempt to hide her body from the world. She was staring up at a massive portrait of a powerful, full-figured historical queen, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and deep-seated insecurity. Ellie noticed her. She quietly excused herself from the main group and walked back toward the girl. She was magnificent, wasn't she? Ellie asked softly, standing shoulder to shoulder with the teenager, looking up at the painting. The girl jumped slightly, looking down at her own feet. She looked so confident. The girl mumbled, I could never look like that. I take up too much space. Ellie felt a familiar ache in her chest. She recognized the crushing weight of a world that constantly demanded women shrink themselves to fit into a predefined mold. She turned to the girl, her expression softening into one of absolute, unwavering warmth. Ellie knelt down slightly, ensuring she was looking the young girl directly in the eye. She placed a gentle, reassuring hand on the teenager's shoulder. Listen to me, Ellie said, her voice ringing with the absolute conviction of a woman who had fought monsters and won. Never let the world tell you to shrink to fit in. You were born to take up space. Own it. The young girl looked up, her eyes shining with tears, a fragile but genuine smile breaking across her face. Across the sunlit atrium, Julian Vance watched his wife heal the world, one soul at a time. He smiled, his heart completely full, knowing that the greatest empire he had ever built was the life he shared with the magnificent woman who had stolen the show. As the final curtain falls on Eleanor and Julian's journey, we are left with much more than just the echoes of gunfire and the fading sirens of the Chicago night. This story, at its very core, is a profound exploration of what it truly means to hold power in a world that constantly tries to strip it away from us. For too long, the narrative has told us that power is loud, violent, and built on the subjugation of others. But Eleanor Hayes steps into the frame to shatter that illusion entirely. She teaches us the revolutionary act of simply taking up space. Society often demands that women, especially those who do not fit conventional molds, shrink themselves. We are told to be quiet, to apologize for our bodies, our intellect, and our presence, just to make others comfortable. Eleanor, a spectacular plus-size woman dropped into a dangerous world of fragile, toxic egos, refused to wear the corsets, both literal and metaphorical, that were handed to her. The most vital lesson she leaves with us is that your worth is not defined by how small you can make yourself, but by the undeniable magnitude of your spirit. You were born to take up space, to be entirely unapologetic in your identity, and to wear your metaphorical crimson dress in rooms that expect you to hide in the shadows. Furthermore, the narrative forces us to examine the heavy, corrupting nature of fear through the eyes of Julian Vance. We often confuse ruthlessness with strength, building thick, impenetrable walls around our hearts to survive the traumas of our past. Julian's transformation reminds us that a kingdom built on terror is merely a prison in disguise. True courage is never measured by the number of enemies you can destroy, but by the vulnerability you are willing to embrace and the innocent lives you choose to protect. It takes a soldier to wage war, but it takes a true king to lay down his weapons, dismantle a toxic empire from the inside out, and actively choose healing over vengeance. Julian proves that it is never too late to rewrite your own script. No matter how deep into the darkness you have traveled, you always have the agency to break the cycles of violence and walk toward the light. Perhaps the most beautiful and resonant takeaway from this entire drama is the undeniable, echoing power of human compassion. One simple, courageous act of defending a terrified waitress at a high-stakes dinner rippled through the underworld, ultimately reaching a pitch-black cell where a young trafficked girl desperately needed a lifeline. Empathy is never a weakness. It is the ultimate rebellion in a cruel world. It is the key that opens iron cages, the shield that deflects bullets, and the anchor that saves us from drowning in our own despair. When we treat every single human life with inherent dignity, we ignite a chain reaction of survival and hope that can bring even the most terrifying syndicates to their knees. We hope that as you leave this story behind, you carry these profound truths with you into your own life. Stand tall, protect the vulnerable, and never, ever apologize for the beautiful space you inhabit. This content was researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaning and valuable lessons.